Today I'm going to do a little comparison. I purchased a Solo light stove just to have one because I thought they were cool, and decided I would go ahead and do a little comparison between the three stoves that I have. I have now the BSR's little cheap Amazon $15-16 stove I got. I just purchased the Solo stove, and I also have my MSR Pocket Rocket 2, which I've had from the very beginning. So what I've done here is I've done a little comparison. What I did was take the three stoves and got them going. I weighed each one of them to see how much they weighed. Obviously the fuel canister and the BRS and the MSR are going to stay constant. You know, the weight varies, you know, depending upon how much fuel you use. But on the Solo stove, you don't bring fuel, so it's pretty interesting. You know, minus the fuel, it ends up being about the same weight. But what I did was I weighed each one. I checked the boil time for each one. I used 1 cup of tepid tap water and timed each one to see how quickly they would come to a boil. I turned each stove onto full blast so it would get a somewhat good comparison. So I used the same conditions on each stove, and I did not use a pot lid so I could look in and see when the boil actually started to happen. The only thing that's a little different obviously is the Solo stove, because it's not using fuel, so I wasn't able to subtract the amount of fuel that it used. By no means am I sponsored by any of these companies. I just decided to do this little comparison because I thought it would be pretty cool with the stoves that I have. So here we go. Alright, so let's weigh the stoves. First, we're going to weigh the Solo stove. And it comes in at 8.9 ounces. And that is with the pot holder ring. Okay, next, the BRS comes in at a measly 1 ounce. And finally, the MSR Pocket Rocket, 2.5 ounces. Alright, here we go. So we got 1 cup of water. We got the Solo stove, which is starting to crank pretty good, and I am going to put the stovetop part on it next and get her going, and then we're going to time it to see how long it takes me to get to a roaring boil. Now understand that it took me time to collect the wood chips, get the fire started and all that, so you know, the time frame thing is not going to work so much for the Solo stove. Alright, here we go. Ready, go. So we're going to let her cook here, and then I'll turn it back on when we got a roaring boil going. Alright, so here we go. We are at 7 minutes, and I've got me a nice roaring boil there going. So from beginning to end, 7 minutes with the Solo stove to get it going to a roaring boil. One of the things that I've learned already is see the rubberized grips there. The flame kicks out there sometimes and burns the bottom of those, so that's one way that you can ruin your pot or ruin your rubber grips using the Solo stove. So you gotta be careful of that. Something new I just learned, but it's all a learning experience from this point on. So we got 7 minutes from start to finish. Now understand that I used as my tinder, this is basically a piece of that palm tree right there, and it wasn't completely dry. It was a little damp to start with, but once I got the fire going with some other little sticks and stuff, it got going good. So I'm using Florida tinder here. Whether that makes a difference or not as to where you're at and how it lights and how hot it burns, maybe. That's a question somebody else will have to answer. Alright, solo stove, 7 minutes to a roaring boil. Alright, experiment number 2. We are going to weigh the fuel canister in grams as to how much fuel is in it before and after we come to a roaring boil. So, fuel canister now at 140 grams. And we will try the first stove. Alright, next stove. The cheap little BRS Amazon stove. Comes in this little pouch here. And we're going to give it a shot. I'm going to run them at full blast. Alright, timer on. Alright, so here we go. Roaring boil at 2 minutes and 50 seconds with the BRS stove. Let's turn her off and weigh the fuel. Alright, let's weigh the fuel after the BRS stove. It was 140. Now it is 128. So 12 grams of fuel it used to get 1 cup of water to a roaring boil. Next, we're going to try the MSR Pocket Rocket. Alright. MSR Pocket Rocket. Same fuel canister. So we are at 128 grams on the fuel canister. I'm going to get her set up and then turn the video back on. Alright, Pocket Rocket, here we go. Just get her started there a little bit. I've got 1 more cup of fresh tap water. Started out at tepid tap water. We'll crank her up and get the start. Alright, so we are at 2 minutes and 25 seconds and boom, we got us a roaring boil here with the Pocket Rocket. So let's check out how much fuel it used. Alright, so we were at 128 grams to come to a roaring boil, the Pocket Rocket. We are down to 120 grams, so it only used 8 grams of fuel to bring 1 cup of water to a roaring boil in less time. Alright, so that was pretty interesting. So pros and cons for each stove. Let's start off with the solo stove since it's kind of an oddball in itself. Basically, there's no need for a fuel canister, so you don't have to worry about getting into town, getting the fuel canister, carrying it, hoping it's going to work. I've heard of some fuel canisters not working sometimes, but so without a canister, you know, that makes it you can fly with it. You don't have to worry about when you get into town tracking down where there might be fuel canisters or anything like that. So it could easily be a great stove if you're going to go out for a few days and not have to worry about getting into a town and you're flying somewhere and worrying about fuel. So one of the downsides for it is that you have to collect the tinder. So when you are at your campsite or whatever, you have to go around and collect the tinder. You can also get some little Esbit cubes or those types of things to help start the fuel or start the tinder if there's no dry stuff around. The Esbit cube will actually burn hard enough, or fast and hard enough to where you could boil the water with just the Esbit cube itself. Getting it lit. If you don't have a cube and you're just trying to light it, you have to have some dry leaves or some little tinder or something like that to get it started. So that's kind of a pain in the butt. And then when it starts cooking, you've got the flame coming up the side of the pot. Now, if you saw on the video, mine has like those little rubber grips on it. Now, it didn't actually burn or melt any of those, but I could see how that could actually tear those things up. And then you have to deal with the soot. There's a whole bunch of soot on the outside of the pot when you cook. Maybe if you use some different fuel or something, it wouldn't soot up as much, but there's a lot of soot. Then you have to dispose of the ashes, which could, fairly simple. You just dig a hole once it burns out fairly quickly. One of the other pros of the Solo stove would be that if you are in a very cold environment, you could actually take that little stove and set it next to you and light your own little campfire rather than have to deal with a fire pit or anything like that. Help keep your hands warm, stuff like that. So pretty neat little device. All right, on the BRS stove, obviously it is the lightest stove of the three, probably the lightest one out there, super light. The only thing about it is that it burns obviously a lot more fuel than the Pocket Rocket. Obviously it doesn't burn any more fuel than a Solo stove, but it burns a lot more of your fuel, so your fuel canister won't last as long if you're using that. And then the Pocket Rocket was actually, to me, the go-to stove. It burned less fuel than the BRS stove, and it actually boiled the water faster, although you are adding more than twice the weight of the stove, or the little stove is twice the weight of the Pocket Rocket. So pros and cons of each one, advantages and disadvantages. It was an interesting experiment. I enjoyed doing it, and hope everybody enjoys. Got more videos coming out, and going to announce my date here on the Continental Divide Trail fairly soon once I get everything locked in. All right, hope everybody's doing well. PT out.